You're about to enter into a new world of knowledge, curiosities, and high strangeness. This is a podcast of Straight Up Strange Productions.
You're listening to Mysteries and Monsters. I'm your host, Paul Bestel. Hello, and welcome to Mysteries and Monsters. Season's greetings. As it's the season of goodwill, here is a bonus edition of Mysteries and Monsters with 2 interviews covering a pair of intriguing mysteries from the eastern side of the United States. First up, I'm joined by author and researcher Mary Joyce, who's here to discuss the stories of the little people from Cherokee legend and the alleged evidence for their existence that was uncovered during construction projects at Western Carolina University in Cullowhee, North Carolina. In the second hour, I am joined by the jovial Dennis Stone, the owner of what is known as America's Stonehenge, who discusses with me the myriad of possibilities for what on earth had been going on at this enigmatic and mysterious site. I hope you enjoy this pair of interviews covering something rather unusual and yet equally mysterious. As always, you can find Mysteries and Monsters across all social media platforms. We're on Patreon if you want to support the show for $4 a month. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. As always, artwork for the show is by Dean Bestel. The show is produced by Brennan Storr of the Ghost Story Guys, and Mysteries and Monsters is a part of the Straight Up Strange network. So wherever you are and whoever you are spending Christmas with, I hope it can be as fun-filled and as loving as it can be. Stay safe and have a wonderful Christmas. Now, put your feet up, grab yourself a mince pie and a glass of sherry, and let's take a trip to 2 very different sides, but yet 2 equally mysterious situations. Since the days of Lewis and Clark, stories of little people living in North America have fascinated many. Almost every Native American tribe have stories, legends, and even encounters with numerous little people going back centuries. Joining me to discuss this fascinating subject is author and researcher Mary Joyce, whose book, The Cherokee Little People Were Real, focuses on discoveries in North Carolina. Mary, welcome to Mysteries and Monsters. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, this is a subject that I have long been intrigued with. One of my real passions is always discovering new things and wanting to learn more, Mary. And Native American legend and lore and tradition is something that I've always had a thirst for, especially since I've started doing this show, because obviously I cover certain subjects such as Bigfoot and Thunderbirds, which obviously occasionally dips into Native American lore. So what was your sort of exposure to it, Mary, and how did you develop this interest that has led you into this path?
Well, I knew nothing about the little people here in the mountains of North Carolina, and for those of you on the other side of the ocean, it's the eastern mountains of the United States. And when I moved here, I began to hear these legends of little people, and I kind of dismissed them as like old Indian, almost like fairy tales. But then I began to really get to know the people around here, and there was an elderly man who was well respected in the area. He was both a pastor for like 40-something years, and he was a World War II hero. And he said, no, these are real. And as a young man, he had been involved with doing early construction at Western Carolina University, which again is here in the Appalachian Mountains. And it seemed like every time they were digging into what was supposed to be virgin soil, they would find these little tunnels. And the tunnels were square-shaped with an arch top. They were always cut into this real dense red clay. They were about 2.5 feet wide and about 3.5 feet tall. And he convinced me that, there was evidence that these things were really real. Very kind man. He introduced me to other old-timers, and I spent many Saturdays one year interviewing the old-timers around their kitchen tables, and these were the men who had been involved in various aspects of construction at the university. And no matter what they were doing, whether they were putting in sewer lines or building foundations for new buildings, they would find these little tunnels. And of course it went beyond that. They began to find little skeletons, and one professor even had a small skeleton he kept on his desk, and he thought it was a child's skull from what he thought was an Indian mound. And one day a high school English teacher picked it up and looked at it real closely and said, "This is not a child's skull. It has all its wisdom teeth." So that kind of gives you an idea of how I began to get into this subject.
It is fascinating, and what I've always found really interesting about these tales, Mary, is that it seems to be one of those collective and connective situations when it comes to North American native languages and tribes, that the vast majority of them, with the little experience of it that I have, seem to all share a variety of stories that most of these tribes had encounters or interactions with them, Mary. And I believe that the North Carolinas is primarily known for the Cherokee more than any other tribe.
And yes, that's correct. And the people, and when I wrote the book, I was simply trying to preserve information from these old-timers before they all passed away. And I did that a number of years ago, turned it into a book much later, because I did more and more research. But anyhow, I simply wanted to preserve this information because I realized when these gentlemen passed on, none of it had been recorded. So I was purely motivated by trying to preserve something before it totally disappeared. And that was the motivation for doing the book. And of course, like you, I started to do more research, and the book has lots of photos and lots of location maps. You know, it's my hope that maybe some, archaeologists will be able to use this as a jumping off block to perhaps find more information. But that's how it all got started.
So what was your educational basis before you discovered this fascinating topic, Mary? What was it that led you to have these interviews with these old-timers? Whilst, I completely agree, because I think preserving such tales and experiences is something that should be admired and only encouraged. So what was it how did you get to that point? Where did you come from prior to this decision to record these interviews and testimonies?
I've done a lot of things in my life. I'm old enough to have collected many different experiences, but perhaps the most important one regarding this project was that I was at one time a newspaper editor back when newspapers were big and the internet had not totally taken them over. And so that natural curiosity about stories, about pursuing them, about validating them, about looking for proof, all of that goes back to probably my newspaper experiences.
Yeah. So, in regards to the stories of the little people in the Carolinas, are we referring to the Yunwi Johnsty, as I believe the Cherokee used to call them?
I don't even attempt to pronounce that. They have a number of words or names for things, and sometimes I will spell them out when I do my writing. I'm not going to stumble all over my tongue trying to say it the way the Cherokee who exists today simply refer to them as the little people. And it's interesting that after you do a book, probably no matter what your subject, people begin to contact you. And you begin to learn more and more. And I'll tell you a cute little story that happened that I learned from actually a very shy Cherokee gal who's in her early 20s. She only opened up and talked with me because I happened to know a friend of hers, and the friend convinced her to talk to me. And she told the experience of when she was a child. Her family had a small trailer up in a very remote part of the reservation, and they used it as a base when the family got together for like picnics or, outdoor celebrations, and that would be their restroom and their cooking place. And one time the kids were all playing hide and seek, and she went to hide in the shower of the little trailer. And when she pulled back the curtain, there was a little man about the size of a toddler, and she described him as looking like Mowgli from the movie The Jungle Books, because he had straight cut dark hair. And it scared her, and she went running to her dad, but she vividly remembers that. And then she related stories by her parents, and her mother had seen them when she was a child, and she'd seen like small circles of these little guys, and she said in all the time that she came across the little people that she only saw one female. The rest were all male that she saw. And another story, which I thought was interesting, was an aunt and uncle of hers lived in an even more remote area of these mountains. They talked about the little people being around where they lived, and to prove it to her, her uncle went and spread flour all over, I don't know, it was over a floor. I don't know if it was a kitchen floor or a porch floor, but anyhow, the next morning there were these little footprints in the flour. And the story I've heard repeatedly now is that there are still little Cherokee people that live in this area. They're hard to come by. Very few people see them or interact with them. But one of the things they're known for is throwing pebbles on the roof if people don't put out food or something for them. And it's the regular people that start this phenomenon. They'll put something out for the little people, and the little people get used to it. And so the pebbles serve as a reminder when somebody has forgotten to put the treat out.
How interesting, because that has a very similar kind of parallel with certain creatures that we have here in the UK known as boggarts, who are known as assistant sprites or elementals, Mary, who in return for food will do you good favours.
How big are these supposed to be?
To knee high at the most.
Okay, so they'd be smaller than the little people, because the little people here are typically like 3.5 feet tall.
Yeah, absolutely.
That I've run into it since I did the book. And one of them ties right into your part of the world, which really kind of surprised me. I got a call from a man who said he had little people living on his land. I said, okay, and I talked to him for quite a while, and he seemed sane. He didn't seem like he was going off on some fairy tale journey. And I arranged to go visit his property, and he lives in eastern Tennessee, which is adjacent to North Carolina. And he has a beautiful piece of property, about 200 acres, rolling hills along a river. Part of this land is like pastoral land and very large rolling hills. And the rest of it's all wooded land, totally undeveloped. And so he showed me a little person's footprint. He showed me the little entrance to where they would go underground. He told me all sorts of tales. And he's the one that got me to learn that there might be a connection with your part of the world. He said that he was like a watered-down version of the Uchi Indians. And he said the Uchi Indians were very different than any other tribe in America. He said their language was very different from any other Indian tribe. They also were able to serve as translators for the different tribes. And there were rumors that some of the early explorers came through the area and found that the Uchis could translate English and German as well. He described the Uchi people as being more fair-skinned. They would more easily sunburn. They had light-colored hair, blue or grayish-colored eyes. So he's going on and on about this. And that these Uchis had these little people that they were like bonded with. Well, I had to go on my own and try to figure out if there was validity to what he was telling me. And there is a expert in Indians in the southeastern part of the United States who had just discovered, just before I started doing this deeper research, that there had been a major flood in Ireland, also along the coast of Spain and France, nearly 5,000 years ago. And that some of those people fled Ireland and ended up by boats, obviously, into a harbor on one of the coastal cities, Savannah, Georgia, and from there they moved inland. So that began to give support to what this man was telling me. And this, in case you talk about being a researcher, the man's name is Richard Thornton, and he's, like I said, a southeastern Indian expert. And he said that the ancestors of the Uchis referred to their homeland or their origin as being from the home of the sun across the Atlantic. So that gives support to, some of these other things I was hearing. And he said there were recent archaeological discoveries that confirmed the Uchi version of history. This flood, which was nearly 5,000 years ago, was dated at about 2250 BC. So maybe the man who contacted me said that he and his father and his grandfather all were able to communicate with these little people because there was this bond. These little people were totally different than the Cherokee little people. They looked European. They wore like leather pants. They wore the shirts that had double-breasted buttons, and were just very, very different. So they're not all the same. And maybe some of the Irish little people came with the Irishmen who fled the flood.
How interesting. How interesting.
I found that really interesting. And the Uchi, because they look so Caucasian, the tribe really doesn't exist anymore. It's been absorbed by other tribes, or I think for the most part the Uchis have just blended into the dominant culture.
How fascinating. The area, Mary, when the university was being built, I believe is in Cullowhee. Now, when was the university buildings created? When did they start the construction of the site?
Well, it's one of those institutions that's evolved, like starting with an old high school, and then it just, different levels of education. It's now a full-fledged university. These discoveries by these men started in the 1930s at some of the early building. When they would cut into the ground, they would find these tunnels. There is an old building on the campus. It's called the McKee Building. It was originally a high school, or maybe even a grade school. And this can only happen in the mountains. It was a 2-story building, and then about World War II era, they began to dig a basement under the 2-story building. And when they did this, they found these more little tunnels. So during the first building, they found tunnels, and then when they dug the basement beneath the building, they found more. And even back in the days when it was grade school or early high school, some of the boys would hide their cigarettes in these tunnels beneath the building. And the way they would get into it is there was a janitor's closet, and when they would go into the janitor's closet, then there was access to where there I think there were at least 3 tunnels by the time they were getting in there. So some of these men grew up to be the same people who did the construction or the early construction projects on campus. So they had experiences as boys and then as men regarding the little people. And one of the things I found fascinating was that there was supposedly an Indian mound on campus, but these old-timers said it wasn't an Indian mound because they discovered that these little tunnels or many of these little tunnels that they were discovering ended up at this Indian mound. And this Indian mound had like a vertical tubular hole, went straight down into it. And when these boys were very young, a farmer had a farm there, and he put multiple logs that would be like 6 to 10 inches in diameter down into this hole to keep the cattle from falling in there. The old-timers said that mound was simply a pile of dirt from these tunnels being built.
So it's at what point, I would presume then, Mary, during the construction these tunnels were removed or filled in?
This kind of shows the blind side of humanity. You would think a university would be absolutely interested in preserving all of this kind of stuff. However, there seems to be 2 reasons why they weren't or aren't. One is they didn't want their construction projects stopped. And 2, if they begin to discover these different things, it would change history. And sometimes academics get locked into what their conventional teaching is and they don't want to change it. So it's sad, because with the remnants of these tunnels where the university is, if they had preserved those, they could have capitalized on them, and it could have been the basis for a great archaeology department.
I mean, that is extremely frustrating, Mary, because, as you say, you would expect an establishment that is built on the development of education and knowledge to simply look at such a situation like this with open arms and think, my goodness, we've got history in front of us. And yet, it seems, from what I can gather, they did everything they could to sort of suppress it and ignore it and just remove it from the area.
One of the, a man contacted me, and he had been a student at the university, and he said that when he was there, he and a couple of buddies were down by, there's a river and a creek that go through that area, and he said they were down by the creek or the river, and the head of security for the campus came by carrying a box that was a little bit bigger than a shoebox, and got into a conversation, or the boys got in a conversation with him, and he, without concern, told them that he was taking one of the little skeletons that they had found where they were building, and he was taking it over to rebury it along an ATV trail. And that just shows you how they were really kind of open about what they were trying to hide. And I heard stories like this quite some time. And the university had more than just the little people skeletons. Two of the anthropology students told me, and they did not know each other, they told me separately, that there had also been two giant skeletons in their forensics lab, or not, storage area, and that they had 6 toes. So it's per foot, I should say. Then I ran into another archaeology student, and she said that probably about 2017, the university sent this collection to the Smithsonian. Just made me really sad, because I'd already done a number of stories about how giant skeletons disappearing at the Smithsonian were really, really very common, and there's been a couple of books done about that phenomena. So we may never see these things again, but the Smithsonian seems to want to preserve traditional history also.
So, were these excavations and tunnels discovered, as you say, prior to the Second World War? Has there been any history of other sites or other areas around the university campus, Mary, that further things have been uncovered? Or is it one of those things where it was just...
No, we seem to have been in an area where it was in a much broader expanse than just there. It looks like there was something that was city-sized where the university is now. But in Silva, which is a town about 5 miles away, when they were digging or constructing a theater, they found the little tunnels. There was, back in the 30s, moonshiners. Mm-hmm. And the moonshiners had a secret still up at the top in a remote area of a mountain south of campus. And they discovered what they call a pile of little bones, which they immediately covered up because they didn't want anybody to discover their moonshine still. So that, that's another way that gives confirmation to something really was happening.
Absolutely.
There's two, first of all, there is a petroglyph, the largest in, I think, the southeast, at least in North Carolina. And it's pretty big. Off the top of my head, and I'm not sure I remember correctly, but when I was there, it seemed like it was like 15 feet across and 12 feet the other direction. And there's all these markings that nobody can understand, even the Cherokee. And it seems to predate the Cherokee. The little people were here first, by the way. But this is another thing that indicates an ancient culture was in the area before the Cherokee arrived. And the Cherokee originated from the Great Lakes region of the United States and then moved toward the Appalachian Mountains. Then there was another historic flood in 1940 here in this area. And a man that I met when he was about 5 years old, during the time of this flood, everything was getting washed away. And he found what he called a lead head. And it was maybe 1.25 inches in diameter. had like a leprechaun face on each side, and it had been washed up from deep in the ground, and it weighed more than it should have for its size. It was heavy, and it had been cast at some ancient time, because you could still see remnants of the seam around the edges of it. And in my book I have a photograph of that. I have a cartoon image of a leprechaun right next to it. You can see the tremendous similarity. So for whatever that's worth, those are two pieces of things that just kind of washed up for us to find, that kind of gives support to the little people.
Yeah. When you were undertaking your interviews in regards to preserving these historical accounts, Mary, was there a central theme in regards to what people were telling you, or were there a variety of experiences and knowledge that they were sharing?
Basically, they all had variations on similar experiences. Some, were busy digging the foundation for the concession stands at the football stadium. Others were putting in the sewer lines. Others were, building the foundations for new buildings. So even though they were working independently during these various construction projects, they were still discovering the same kind of tunnels and the same little skeletons.
How remarkable.
There was not conflict between the people.
So it was a consistent set of information that was coming across from everyone then?
I didn't find any conflict. All of the people that I interviewed, except for two, were the old-timers who at one time were involved in the construction projects. I also got to interview a woman who was, I believe, the great-great-granddaughter of a Cherokee hero. And she told me that she felt that these little people back in ancient times came from the stars, which is not totally shocking, because the Cherokee believed that in ancient times they originated from the Pleiades, which is a star formation. And they have hidden their origination stories in tales of the seven sisters, because there's 7 stars in the Pleiades. So the idea that the little people and the Cherokee came from out there somewhere is dominant in the old culture of the Cherokee.
When you've spoken to people from the tribe, and because obviously North Carolina also has one of the largest Cherokee reservations, I believe, Mary, out in the, I believe it's the Eastern Cherokee Reservation, which is the largest one, because I think the biggest one is in Oklahoma, is that right?
Yeah, the ones out in Oklahoma originated from here in the Appalachian Mountains, or the Eastern Mountains. They were driven out. There was something that historically they call a Trail of Tears, where the Cherokee were literally marched out to Oklahoma. So that's how that part of the Cherokee originated. The ones who hid in the mountains and stayed behind are the ones that are here where I live.
Yeah. So in regards to the Cherokees' experiences, as you say, when you released your book, and I would imagine you've obviously spoken to many people who have Cherokee heritage, Mary, are people still having encounters, as you refer to the young girl who stumbled across one? Because often when we speak about the stories of little people, regardless of what they are, because I know in Ireland there is a bit of a cliche when people will say, yeah, well, you don't see them these often these days due to how popular it is, and incredibly a folklorist from over here discovered some interviews at the turn of the last century, when the 19th century became the 20th, and a lot of people were saying exactly the same thing 100 years ago, where they were basically saying, oh well, yeah, because of the encroachment you just don't see them as often these days.
You don't, and there's two reasons you don't hear a lot about it. One is I don't think the little people want to be discovered any more than the Bigfoot want to be discovered. And by the way, we have those here in the mountains too. Also, the Cherokee have a history of being made fun of for talking about such things, so they learn to shut up about it. Even today, they're not going to open up about it very easily. When I moved here, I began working in a place where I met a lot of the Cherokee, and they eventually became comfortable with me. So they began to open up. I don't think I could have just knocked on their door and gotten the stories out of them. They have to trust you. It takes time and patience sometimes to get the stories.
Absolutely. I think regardless of what type of phenomenon you're speaking about, Mary, my experience, and from what I've read and what I've seen, is that most Native American tribes are very reticent when it comes to sharing information for people outside of their tribal circle, as it were, or people that don't aren't from the reservation or whatever. Primarily, as you touched on there, because they're often treated with disdain or belittled for having such, as some people would call it, ridiculous beliefs, and still holding on to these encounters with little people and Bigfoot and other such creatures that populate their folklore and legend, Mary. So was it a slow process where you basically had to earn their respect, or did you find that by looking into this, word got out that you were investigating such stories and experiences, and people wanted to give you an opportunity to learn more?
Most of my book originates with the people who were doing the construction in the building at the campus. I had met the woman that I told you about, who was the great-granddaughter of the Cherokee hero. His name was Sally. And I had met her long before I started talking about these kind of things. And when she found out I was interested, she opened up with me because I'd already established a friendship with her. But again, it's a matter of trust. The only time that I have had quick results getting a story from an Indian was when I went out in the western part of the United States to a place called the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, which is in South Dakota. That's the desert flat, well, they have mountains too in the western part of our country. And I went there for several reasons, but I met this young woman who was late 20s, I would guess. And her grandfather had been a shaman or a medicine man. Her older brother was, at the time I talked to her, a shaman. And she had like spiritual gifts, and for some reason she just read that I was, or picked up that I was okay to talk to. And she told me a couple of interesting stories that she had experienced firsthand. There was one time when she, and I guess she was a young teenager or pre-teenager, and some of her cousins went with her grandmother out to the creek or river to go fishing. So they set the grandmother up in a chair to do the fishing, and then they went further away so they could swim in the creek. And they saw something out of the corner of their eye plunge into the water, and then they saw bubbles, and they went running back to where the grandmother was. Well, the second step of this was that the grandmother had just caught a fish, had nothing to do with what they had seen, and it was getting away, so she told the kids to go in and catch it before it got totally off the line. And when they did, they caught the fish, and as they're coming out of the creek, they see these little tiny footprints going up the bank of the creek, the same place where they had seen something splish and splash in the water when they were swimming. So that's one part of the story. Second part of the story was that I can't remember who it was now, but one of her relatives and some of his buddies were in the same creek, only further down, and they discovered like a little cave near the creek. And they found small bows and arrows and a quiver and a small drum. And they found that really fascinating. They took this stuff and they took it back to show their grandfather, who immediately told them to take it back, that they shouldn't bother the little people's stuff. And they had a little bit of trouble after that. The little people killed a couple of their pigs and chickens, and I guess it's, if you're little, you have to find some way to get across to people to leave you alone. That didn't continue, but that was an immediate reaction on the part of the little people to their stuff being taken.
Yeah, I mean, did you uncover any kind of stories or encounters, Mary, where people had crossed them, as you refer to there, you know, someone's found some of their belongings and taken it away, which clearly offended them? There is often a tradition of, especially in Europe, of not double-crossing or messing with little people because it will only end badly on you. Did you come across that kind of established reaction in regards to how they dealt with the little people, or was it more of a symbiotic relationship that they got along and they both respected each other?
Okay, this was the only really violent reaction that I'd ever seen, and that was out in South Dakota. Here, there seemed to be a bond with the little people. In fact, and these are only stories, I cannot confirm these, but supposedly some of the little people went with some of the Cherokee on the Trail of Tears when they were moved out or forcibly removed out to Oklahoma. I just, but the most I ever hear around here is sometimes they call them mischief makers. But I don't hear about violence and things like I heard with this episode with out in South Dakota.
Yeah, I mean, with my limited knowledge, Mary, what I seem to have come across is that they are classed as being mischievous or impish, as where that term comes from as well, in regards to how they will treat humans when they come across them. But essentially, they don't mean anything by it, and they're just naturally mischievous, and more often than not, they will actually help people if they feel that they require it.
Sounds like our stories are similar.
Yes. So, as this has developed, obviously once you uncovered this collection of experiences from the construction of the university, did you start to look around the southern United States where you are in regards to other sites that could potentially have such constructions on them, Mary, or has this one been the biggest one that you've managed to stumble across so far?
Well, I'd like to try to deal with things firsthand. So firsthand would be here with the little people in North Carolina. The second one would be the one in eastern Tennessee, and then out in South Dakota. Those are all where I have been involved in the research rather than copying other people's research. I can expand a little bit on what I learned with the little people in Tennessee. The story that's popping to my head right now is the man who I call Xander. He had some people or some men doing some new fencing on his open pastoral land. And he saw them suddenly just running like crazy, got in their cars and took off. They didn't come back for their pay. He didn't know what had happened. He thought maybe they'd had an emergency. And they were from another country. He never indicated where they were from. I'm guessing they probably were Mexican. And they he ran into them, I should say, when he was in town. And he asked them why they didn't come back for their money or what had happened. And they got around to asking him, did he ever hear singing in the fog? And the little people are known for singing in the fog. Now, don't ask me why. Maybe it's because they're not seen in the fog. I could actually see like a small circle that had been tromped down that was at the top of one of these hills overlooking the river. And that's also where I saw the little footprint. And so this had scared these workers. And they came out and asked him if he was the equivalent of a witch or a wizard or whatever, because they thought he was causing some of this. But he already knew that the little people sometimes did this.
So do they have as you refer to, a tradition for singing and dancing then, Mary? Because that seems like, once again, a very similar parallel with European stories. So do the Cherokee speak of them being a jolly tribe? Because that seems remarkably similar in regards to what we find in European law.
The more I learn, the more it seems like it's around the world. There's little people around the world. They have special names for them. They've been found in, or remnants of them have been found in South America, in Hawaii. So it's a world phenomena. And at one time, it must have been a very dominant small race of people that populated the earth. In fact, and I can't quote it now because I read it so long ago, I can't give you too much information, but there are cultures that credit the little people as being the source of wisdom that they would turn to to learn things.
Absolutely. So when you began this journey, Mary, what was the point where you suddenly realised that these just weren't stories and the possibility of exaggeration? Was there a point where a light went off and you thought, these people are telling me the truth?
When you sit down at somebody's kitchen table and you look them in the eye, you get a really strong feeling if they're being straight with you. And every single one that I met with kind of passed the proof test. So it didn't take me long to believe it. Now, from the time that I first heard about little people, it was many, many years before I ever even got a semblance of a photo of one. And there's a couple that lives on a mountain ridge not too far to the west of where I live, and they had a webcam set up where they live, and they live up the top of this ridge, and it becomes like a one-lane dirt road to get up there. And some kind of a bird or an animal had triggered the webcam to go off. And in the distance, you can see this kind of fuzzy image of what looks like a nude little person across the road and in the woods. And the couple debated between themselves about contacting me because they were debating. One thought it was a spirit, and one thought it might actually be something real. And finally, they decided just to show me the photo. And what I did was I used the computer, and you can turn up the intensity of the color. And if something's alive, it will go into the magenta range. And if it's not, it will a ghost-like figure will stay in a ghosty white, grayish kind of color. It will not go into magenta. This figure in the forest went into magenta, which indicates it was something very much alive. To convince people that there might be credibility to this idea, I found a ghost photo that supposedly is legitimate, and it shows a ghost crawling on the floor with a young child that's alive. And so I took that photo, and when I increased the intensity of the color, the child became magenta, and the ghost crawling or playing with the child on the floor stayed white. And so it was years before I even got that much of an image, because getting a photo of little people or Bigfoot is pretty darn hard to do.
Have you often found that where there are stories of little people, there are stories of Bigfoot, or do they tend to also congregate in different areas, Mary? Because I know there are certain tribes that refer to them as two separate, as far as they're concerned, they're two separate tribes. One's very large and one's very small.
And I would regard them as two separate tribes. But we have both here where I live, here in the Appalachian Mountains. They also had Bigfoot on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. I don't think they necessarily, are a team out there together.
Yes.
I think they may just prefer the remote spots, the remote locations.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems that both have congregated as far away from humanity as possible, it would seem.
Well, there's days I can understand that.
Yes, yes, I completely agree as well. Yeah, absolutely. So, as this has developed, Mary, have you been surprised that you're still coming across new information, or once it's one of those things where once you release the top of the box, nothing surprises you anymore in regards to what's coming forwards?
I've learned that you should never be totally surprised by anything. I mean, so I guess that's a simple answer to what you're asking.
Yeah. Is it something that is continuing to develop, Mary, and you're uncovering new information all the time, or is it something where you're really having to dig about to get new leads and new information in regards to such stories and experiences?
Well, this is probably a good time to point out that I'm the editor of a website called skyshipsovercachers.com. If you just type in Skyships Over, you will probably find it on the internet. Cachers is a mountaintop town here, and it's spelled just like a cashier at the store, skyshipsovercachers.com. And we started out because there were a lot of UFOs being seen in this area, especially over the town of Cashers. And we didn't know when we started that website that it was going to grow into something much more than that. We have ended up dealing with all sorts of cutting-edge topics, little people, Bigfoot, UFOs, hidden underground military bases are examples of some of the subjects that we cover. So I am not locked into just being an investigator of one topic. So I'm not out there beating the bushes to keep expanding on the Little People Project. When I find stuff, I present it on the website, but that's not my only motivation.
Is it something that, as as you look into it more, Mary, are there other sites that you're aware of in the United States where these stories and alleged constructions and communities were based?
Well, I found out that there's a huge number of graves that have been found in Tennessee, which again is adjacent to where I am. There was a man who is known as the father of, I think, Tennessee history, and back during the time that he was living, he confirmed that there were all sorts of little graves that were found. So I, added that to the website. So the expansion of what I do shows up on the website.
So is it something that, since you've written the book and got to know a lot more about it, Mary, is it something that you think you've got enough information to collate another volume or to expand on your original piece of work, or is it perhaps something that you're just going to do something completely different next?
None of my books are similar. The four that I have in print right now, there's one called, as we talked about, Cherokee Little People Were Real. The most recent one is Bigfoot Beyond the Footprints. Another one is Underground Bases Hidden in North Carolina Mountains. And the fourth one is totally different, and it's called Tangible Evidence of Jesus Left Behind for Us to Find. So I guess I'm still the product of the newspaper business, and when I find something interesting, I like to pursue it. There's a lot of effort to doing a book, and the books that I do are not just words. Sometimes I think just sitting down and writing the words would be the easy part. Each one is more like a coffee table book. They're 8.5 by 11 with lots and lots of photos, because we live in a very fast-moving society, and if you really want people to learn something, you have to present it in a condensed, easy-to-read form, and if you have visuals to go along with it, people are much more likely to read what you have and to learn from it.
The other aspect of all this is that, as someone that has a real interest in Bigfoot, Mary, I'm not one of those because I've seen numerous reports of Bigfoot appearing all over the US and Canada. Primarily, I think a lot of people are still under the misapprehension that it's just in the northwest, in Washington and Oregon and over the border into Canada. But as someone that has a real interest in that particular aspect of cryptozoology and the unknown, I'm always fascinated when certain areas, especially in the southern US, have flaps. And I noticed a couple of years ago that North Carolina seemed to be having a real uptick in Bigfoot sightings. So is that something that's continued, and are people more comfortable talking about such things now, Mary? Because it seems that it's certainly changed over the last 10 years about how open some people are in the Carolinas to discuss their Bigfoot encounters.
I haven't seen much hesitation to talk about Bigfoot. Not like the Cherokee are always very cautious about talking about the little people. But I do not find that kind of caution very extensive when it comes to Bigfoot.
Yeah. Do you think that's just because it's the modern interpretation is that people are a lot more comfortable talking about hairy giants than they are small people, or do you think it's just that at the moment Bigfoot is culturally pretty acceptable?
There's more Bigfoot activity that people can see and hear than there is evidence of little people. Yeah. So that keeps it going more than the whole little people phenomena. For example, the footprint that I was shown in eastern Tennessee, was very faint because these little people don't weigh a lot. So unless they're stepping into some really wet clay, the footprint they leave behind is going to be very, very light. That is not true of the Bigfoot. They leave some whopper Bigfoot prints behind. And in the book, I get way beyond just, chasing down footprints. There's a whole lot of stories in there, and they have to do with really like the good human side of the Bigfoot. They have families. They have been known to help people and to save people. They have, they've befriended certain people. They're very cautious about who they're going to pick, but they will befriend them. And we did studies with which foods they preferred. And, they definitely have preferences. We had a gifting site where we would put stuff out for a while. They have their own language or languages. They don't all speak the same language. There's just so much about them that is beyond the simple prints and the ordinary things that we hear so much about. So my whole book is devoted to showing that other side of the Bigfoot. And I'll give you one quick story to give you a feel of that, and then I'm sure we're pushing your time on this. There is a woman she's kind of like an earth mother. She just takes care of and loves everybody. And Bigfoot lived on her wooded property. And she had a pony, and the pony would be put in, a pasture with a fence every night, and every morning the pony would be gone and out in the woods. So she finally got to the point where she got a very, very, very long boat rope and would tie him down. He would still disappear. And she found him in the woods with the rope still attached. And the Bigfoot had actually taken the pony's food source out to where they were in the woods, had taken his water thing out to where he was in the woods. And the cutest part of the story was when she got her pony back again, there were little tiny butt prints on the pony. And the Bigfoot were giving their children rides on her pony.
Wow.
So that just gives you a whole different insight. And genetically, we are not, we're like distant cousins. The maternal side of the Bigfoot is human. The paternal side, the father side, the daddy side, is some unknown primate. So it has its own unique genetics, and somehow we have that similarity because the human maternal side is human.
Yeah, absolutely. And encounters with offspring are extremely rare. I can think of a few encounters that people have claimed to see female Bigfoots with their offspring, Mary, but it does seem to be an aspect of the whole phenomenon that is very rarely reported.
And I got disgusted with people just being obsessed with hunting them down like some kind of an unusual animal that they just want to hang on their wall, and there's too much of that. Or I got bored with just seeing, castings of footprints, big deal. So being able to discover these stories about the human side of them or the nice side of them, I just thought needed to be put out there, and that's why I did the book Bigfoot Beyond the Footprints.
Fascinating.
And if anybody's interested in any of the subjects we've been talking about, my books are all available on Amazon, which, you can tap into internationally.
Yeah, absolutely. Right then, Mary. Well, listen, it's been fascinating to talk to you about a couple of these subjects. It's really given us food for thought. So where can everybody find more information and check your website out and as you mentioned, hunt down your books?
The website again is called skyshipsovercachers.com. If you type in Skyships Over, it will probably pop up on your internet. Cachers is spelled Cashhiers, skyshipsovercachers.com. On that website, you can always use the search bar and type in little people or whatever you want to check on, and there's a reasonable search bar that you can find some of those things on. Under Editor's Corner, you can read a brief summary of each of my books, and they're all available through Amazon. And again, the titles are Cherokee Little People Were Real, Bigfoot Beyond the Footprints, Underground Bases Hidden in North Carolina Mountains, and Tangible Evidence of Jesus Left Behind for Us to Find.
Fantastic. Well, listen, Mary, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a real pleasure, and I'm really glad we finally managed to get to speak to each other because we've had a couple of technical issues, but we got there in the end. So thank you for your time, and I wish
Paul,
you...
It was a pleasure talking with you, Paul. Thank you so much.
My pleasure as well. You take care. All the very best to you and yours, and have a lovely Christmas.
You too.
A big thank you there to Mary for joining me today. Right, next up, Dennis Stone joins me to discuss his controversial archaeological site, now known as America's Stonehenge. Since it first came to prominence at the beginning of the 20th century, it has caused consternation, confusion, and to help us navigate is the site's owner, Dennis Stone. Dennis, welcome to Mysteries and Monsters, sir. How are we?
Oh, I'm doing fine, Paul. Thank you so much for having me on.
Now, this is a site that I've been aware of probably since the mid-90s, and it more so came to my mind fairly recently, the last couple of years, because incredibly I managed to finally track down the infamous series In Search Of, which was shown here when I was a very young chap, so it was before my time and before I was into the weird and wonderful things in the world, Dennis. And looking back, it's quite remarkable, because I think it was one of the very first episodes that show did, was they actually visited the site in the 1970s. So for anybody that doesn't know what we're talking about or where we are, can you just give us a brief synopsis, Dennis, of what America's Stonehenge is and why it causes so many issues for a lot of people?
Well, America's Stonehenge, is, as you mentioned, is located in southern New Hampshire in the town of North Salem. We're about 40 miles north of Boston, Massachusetts, and about 20 miles from the seacoast. But we're in the southern New Hampshire town of North Salem, and the site basically shouldn't be here. It consists of about 110 acres, and it has stone structures, it has standing stones that align astronomically. There are actually 51 astronomical alignments. It has a complete network of underground drains. It has plazas, courtyards. It has ramps, and it has, again, chambers that you can go inside of that are highly reminiscent of the sites I've seen throughout Europe. You know, there's like something like 50,000 megalithic sites in Western Europe. But we're learning that they're a worldwide phenomena. You know, the latest I heard in New Zealand, I did a radio show out of New Zealand a couple of years ago, but the host never mentioned anything about that. So I think it's a relatively new find. But Australia, South Africa, South America, and throughout the Northeast, this is not the only site, though. There are about 800 sites that we've located over the years, from Quebec, Canada, all the way down to the mid-Atlantic states, with similar features of our site. The difference with our site, it's kind of a Reader's Digest version. It's kind of everything on about 110 acres that you find elsewhere in the country, spread out over many, many, hundreds of acres, basically. And we think it's a ceremonial site. We don't believe it was a living site. Some of the chambers look like something from the Flintstone cartoon, but again, they're not, they kind of look like that, but they're really not living. And the amount of debris that come out of the site is not the quantity that you'd find at a living place where people threw their trash, for instance. And I believe that, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but most of the sites I've seen in Europe, other than like Sierra Bray and I think Stanley Dale and a couple others, were generally not a place of habitat, generally a place of worship, burial, I guess observation of heavenly, alignments. For people lived over there like in England and elsewhere where they built these megalithic sites. It sheds a lot of light on the culture, who the people were, how they lived. So the site we think is about 4,000 years old. We think it's a ceremonial site, and it even has something new we found in the last 4 years we call serpent walls. And these serpent walls can vary from something like 30 feet, and they might average around 100 feet, but the longest one we have, we believe, is 2,550 feet. And the serpent wall will be a wall that has a head, and it can be a boulder that's shaped like a serpent's head, or a stacked head of stone. It undulates either horizontally or vertically. Usually end up with some sort of a pointed tail. And these are not only found here. I found my first one in the spring of 2016, and they were used to clear fields of rock, so you wouldn't plow and hit a rock each year. Rocks come out of the ground with frost and everything. Also a boundary, and also stock fences to keep animals in or out of an area. Sometimes they served all three purposes. But they generally are linear or pretty straight with some exceptions. But the walls, if you look at our map of our walls, they turn, they twist, they bend. But in those walls, we have been finding these serpentine walls. So now we have about 13 serpentine walls, including that one that goes 2,550 feet, we believe. It undulates, and it's an amazing structure, the head of it anyway. It's just simply amazing. It's also a lunar minor standstill moonrise alignment. This wall touches every four-site alignment with the sun, moon, and stars. It covers about 15 acres. So of the 110, and it kind of wraps it around. Its body goes around, it undulates, it touches all those alignments counterclockwise, comes back in front of its head. It does one more hump, just like a serpent's tail could, a 90-degree twist with a pointed tail, and we've been walking by that since the 1950s, and other people have been walking about it over 100 years because people used to picnic up here and never noticed it. But it's like the Ouroboros, we think, and the Ouroboros would be a serpent biting its tail. And if it is, if, that's a big question. It would be kind of like, it means eternity, or it can mean the circle of life, Yeah. And it has other meanings too. Protection is another thing the serpent can represent, and it does surround the most of the complex, the 15 acres where most of the complex is located, kind of protecting that, saying this is more of a sacred area, perhaps. Mm-hmm. And the outside of that is not the sacred area. I've talked to Maria Wheatley about that, and she was very eloquent in describing what I'm trying to describe to you probably better, because she knows about our site. She's got a lot of photographs. I send her stuff continuously, and she's really excited about it.
I mean, Dennis, it's a very intriguing site, because how on earth did this, because I believe your father passed this down to yourself, so how did your father get involved with this? Because for my understanding, this site was basically, it was just there, and nobody really paid much attention to it, I think, until the beginning of the 20th century, like I say, because I think the first real reference to it as a sacred area or a site of interest happened, I think there was a book came out about 1907, wasn't there, Dennis? And that's where the story kind of brings itself into the modern day, where people began to think, why on earth is this site here? And obviously this site, who built it? Why is it here?
So that's right, Paul. Yeah. So it was a book called The History of Salem, and Edgar Gilbert put together the book back in 1907. And he was actually a friend of Robert Frost, the poet, and they worked together in Lawrence, which is just below us, Lawrence, Massachusetts, at the mills, the huge mills back, at that time. And they actually knew each other and probably did a little poetry together. But so when Edgar Gilbert wrote the book, so he said it was a wild but wonderful place among the rough boulders and soft pine where weird tales may be woven. You can see a little poetry there. So that was in 1907. So there were other, vague references to the site, but unfortunately nothing as clear as that one about the Gunjawamp site, which John Pynchon wrote in, 1654 about strange, stone fort or whatever, strong fort down in Groton, Connecticut. However, you're right. That's when people became a little bit more aware of the site. But my uncle, who passed away a few years ago, he was World War II. He just passed away 5 years ago, and he was heavily involved with the research on the astronomy back in the 70s. And he moved to New York. His wife had Alzheimer's. He moved to the oldest daughter's house on Long Island. So before he left me his little library of some of his books. But he said, he goes, hey, Dennis, my grandmother, Annie Gage, used to live in Salem, and I was aware of that. She used to play in this site back in the 1890s. So my family's, connection goes back to probably around 1890, somewhere around there. My aunt and uncle on my mom's side, that's on my dad's side, I just mentioned my mom's side, my aunt and uncle used to play here back in the 1930s. They would come down here on their bicycles, they were dating, and they were picnicking up on the site, and that's when a lot of people were picnicking. And that's when the archaeology began in 1937 by a gentleman named William Goodwin. So the interest probably was triggered by that 1907 book, and then people would come down here and cause damage, play, and whatever else in the chambers and, mess around up here. But it was 1937 that a chain link fence was put up with barbed wire to protect the site. It's still there today. It still looks like a brand new fence. It's pre-World War II. And Mr. Goodwin was he was an amateur archaeologist, just an antiquarian kind of, and archaeology back then didn't have the methodology and the precision that they use today, but what he did is he photographed the site, and he began clearing the brush, debris, and uncovering the ruins, and then doing some repairs. And he got a lot of, compliments and criticism. He wrote 4 books, and the book in 1946 came out called The Ruins of Great Ireland and New England. He put forth his theory that the Irish Caldy monks were here before the Vikings, and this was an Irish Caldy monk monastery over 1,000 years old. And he mentions 13 other places in the Northeast too, in New England basically. But we think he was kind of in the right idea that it was pre-Columbian, that it, is an old ancient site, not historic farmer, colonial or post-colonial. But we believe it's a much older site than he had. He didn't have radiocarbon dating of it. He died in 1950, the year that radiocarbon dating actually was kind of invented, if you will, by Dr. Livy. So he didn't have that technology, but he wrote several books, one about the truth about Leif Erikson's. But he's from Hartford, Connecticut. His first cousin was J.P. Morgan. And they put together an early American antique collection that's still in Hartford, Connecticut at the Wordsworth Athenaeum, like 120 years later. Morgan died in 1913, I believe, and Goodwin died in 1950. So they're first cousins of, quite an age difference. But so Morgan never was involved with this site, of course. But Goodwin just loved the ancient past. and he lived in Ohio. Actually, would go out on weekends and map some of the 10,000 mounds in Ohio. He didn't map all of them, obviously, but he would go on weekends, and that data is still there, I guess, for the state of Ohio. So he had a real big interest in anything ancient, basically. And he lived in Jamaica and was really interested where Columbus landed down in the Caribbean on his 4 voyages, It's particularly the first one. So he was all into that kind of stuff, and Leif Erikson and all that. So the site, 1907 and 1930s, the first archaeological research. He dies in 1950, still believing that the Irish monks built the site, and everything up here was a beehive chamber, although most of the structures really have core belling, but they're not really beehive structures,
So, I mean, Goodwin's the chap that kind of really brings this to the public's attention, isn't he, Dennis? Because I think, did Goodwin kind of take over the site in, was it mid-1930s, and then he's started to kind of excavate it and really start to try and dig down into finding out what on earth this was?
That's correct, yeah. So he hired a crew. He first saw the site in 1936. The year before, however, there was a Reverend Ward, and Reverend Ward was very interested in this, and there are some newspaper articles with pictures. So that got it out to the press even before Goodwin. Besides the 1907 history of Salem, there was some newspaper articles. And actually, if we go back to 1920, we have 4 photographs of the site that show what the site looked like 16 years before Goodwin ever stepped foot. And the reason I mention that, some people think Goodwin, altered the site tremendously. He did alter the site. He did take out the brush, the debris. He removed the dirt, dug, found artifacts. But he actually did repair work, too. So you can see what it looked like before Goodwin and after Goodwin, if anybody has a question to that. Not only with the 4 1920 photographs that we have that are actually dated, but the newspaper articles, like the Haverhill Gazette, I think. I got them right on our files here. There's Reverend Ward, right, in different places in the site. You can see it, before Goodwin did anything to the site. But you're correct. So he purchased the land, about 20 acres, and he worked on the site for the next 13 years until his passing in 1950. And he worked primarily on what we call the main site. That's about 1 acre, and that's where the chain link fence is. Of course, we think the entire hilltop today is just loaded with all sorts of stone wall features and, quarried stones and, the serpentine walls, the windows and everything. They're all over the hilltop. So it's not just that 1 acre, but that's what he focused on for many years.
So has anybody kind of done any investigation into where the stones have come from, Dennis? Are they all from the locality, or has anything been imported into the area, or is it just purely using the natural surroundings to create this structure?
Yeah, that's a great question, Paul. Yeah, the rounded rocks, the glacial erratics and the great glacial, what we call the field stones were probably brought in here, during the glacial period, that deposited on the hill. And there's quite a few of those up there. And they actually, one thing we noticed, besides the serpent wall and the windows in the wall, we noticed that the walls tend to go to a glacial boulder, which is natural. And then the wall will take a slight turn and go off into a different direction to another glacial boulder. And then it might zigzag to another glacial boulder. If a farmer was running a wall, a professional stone wall, you might use a couple of these walls if they're in line with the wall, but not like the zigzaggy thing connecting these boulders. So those are brought here by, the glaciers. And the same thing happens in North Stonington and some other sites in Pennsylvania and New York, by the way, connecting the boulders, connecting the dots, They wanted to do this for some reason. We don't know why, but the walls look like a drunken wall builder built them, They just go back and weird. But some of them are serpentine in shape. But the other big slabs of stone that make up the roof slabs, and the biggest one we know so far is about 14 tons. And these are from the hilltop. And what the hilltop is bedrock. It's solid. It is foliated. It does come up in layers like an onion, and you can peel it up. And the ancient people were able to peel up the bedrock all over the hill, and they were raising up these big slabs, like I mentioned, up to about 14 tons, and they would use them for either roof slabs or wall slabs. A wall slab is a big slab stood on its end, and the word orthostat, you've probably seen the word orthostat. You find them all over Europe, these great big stones stood on their end. Yeah. And they make up a chamber, or they can just be in the stone wall as a vertical stood stone. Or they can be one of our monoliths that look kind of like an arrowhead shape. that would be one of the alignments for the sun, moon, or stars, So they did do quarrying. They were removing stones. Today, the hilltop's covered with a layer of soil that's, very slowly accumulating. They say it's about 120 years for an inch of soil from windblown soil and vegetation decay. It's a very slow, it's a very slow process, but the hill's slowly getting covered up from the time of the glacial period. But if you had a time machine and you could go backward, you see this hilltop would look more bare as you go further into the past, and the walls would be just sitting basically on bare bedrock. And I could send you and a couple other crewmates out and say, gee, I need a stone maybe this big by this big. Could you please go out and get me one? You'd be today going like, where do you want me to go, Dennis? To hope it's all brush, it's all trees, it's all dirt. Where am I going to? I don't have ground penetration radar on me, and I don't have Superman vision, so where do you expect me to go find over 110 acres? But back then, you could actually visually walk around and say, okay, this looks like a great candidate area for me to, to get in here, and there's like a natural, maybe a feet vault in the rock, maybe a little crack, and I can work that, and I can get this slab out of here, You could actually visually see it and work it. So there are about 34 slabs that are laying on the hilltop, and we keep finding more of them that have been propped up with a fieldstone, one of these rounded rocks, maybe a foot and a half across. So they've been separated from the bedrock, they've been raised, propped up, and what they were doing at that point is a thing called percussion flaking, taking a hammerstone and smashing the edge of it to knock off little flakes, and it kind of looks serrated, like a serrated edge. And we found the first one in 1982. That particular stone was northwest of the main site, probably 300 feet, and one of our staff members had a picnic lunch on it, and she was already informed to look for stones that might be raised, and maybe there's an edge that's been worked, to shape it or dress it. And as she sat there, she noticed it had scalloping on the edge where she was sitting, and the stones seemed to be raised up. The stone probably about 12 feet, maybe 11 feet long, and probably about 5 feet wide, and maybe 6 inches thick. But it was raised up, and as she got underneath it, I guess, and looked, she could see something holding it up in the air. It was another rock. The next year, a gentleman named Dr. David Stewart Smith, he actually spent quite a bit of time in the early 70s, 6 years over in your country, working for, I believe, if it was called English Heritage back then, but doing restoration on medieval structures and megalithic sites. But he actually did an excavation, and it was overseen by Dr. Gary Hume, our state archaeologist, who was a mainstream outsider, not really familiar with megalithic sites, It's not the type of archaeology he knew, but he knew how they made arrowheads, and how they made spear points, and how they made stone axes, the percussion flaking technique used to make these devices, these instruments. So he knew that technique. And when he saw these stones, he said, this is unmistakable. This is the same Stone Age technology used to shape a stone as to make, it's like a 1.5-ton arrowhead, basically. And so he kind of, agreed that this is Stone Age technology used not only to split the bedrock, raise it, and then the percussion flaking along the edge of it to shape it to whatever shape they were trying to get. Because the next step would be to move the stone on the site and use it for something like a roof slab, wall slab. For some reason, back in the 80s, we found the first one. We found a few more in the 80s and 90s, but just in the last few years, we found about 20 more, and some of them are very sizable and some are small, but they're propped up, and they show that serrated edge. And before Dr. David Stewart Smith died in 2016, I found a couple more, and he said, yep, you can see the serrated edge. Yeah, it's been propped up. It kind of dawned on us that these guys who were building the site had a bigger plan, and some of these stones were 1,000 feet from the main site, so they had to be dragged up the hill and then used for construction purposes. And I was watching a show about Stonehenge. Some of the stones came out of Wales, the blue stones, and Marlborough Downs for the bigger ones. But they say some of the stones never made it their intended construction site, and they call them lazy stones. The stones sitting there. Well, that's what we're calling ours too. We have maybe 30, maybe 34 of them, and we've GPSed them. So we know what they are, and which is kind of cool. Now you can actually see it on a map, like, oh my God, look at, they're all over the hilltop. But they are lazy stones. They never made it to the intended, whatever their purpose was going to be. And so, although we thought the site might have been completed for many years, maybe they finished it, maybe it was used over by different cultures, maybe it seemed to be the case. Maybe they were done with it, and just, it's fallen to the ravages of time and people and trees falling on the structures, and then other vandalism and stuff. But maybe the site was going to be a bigger site, and these people for some reason packed it up and said, okay, we're done, we're leaving.
Absolutely. One of the things I've often been intrigued with, because with the greatest respect, Dennis, some people are very dismissive about this, but one of the things I find really compelling is the fact that a lot of people say, oh, well, it's just something that was built 200 years ago by a guy. I think it's John Patley, I believe. A lot of people claim
Paddy,
that he built it all. But I've seen several videos and programs about this. There seems to be quite a lot of trees of a certain that predate Patty, because obviously they've been dated, that have grown over the stones and around the stones and in and through the stones. So that to me clearly shows that this construction predates Patty, and I think a lot of people aren't prepared to kind of accept that, because the tree itself proves that these structures and these buildings and these shapes were clearly there before Patty.
Yeah, that's a great point, Paul. The Pattys have been first. They bought a piece of property up here in 1734. It was Seth Patty, a third-generation shoemaker. And then he bought another piece of property in 1744. By then, New Hampshire and Massachusetts had settled their boundary, and we were no longer part of Haverhill, Massachusetts. We're now part of the Salem district. So we have a pretty good record of the Patty family. Again, there were 5 generations of shoemakers, and Jonathan, the one that gives people give him a lot of credit. They said, well, he must have built everything. It doesn't look like a farm or a shoe shop at all. Well, he must have been crazy. That's their answer. That's their data. He's crazy. But actually, he was a tax collector. There's no record of him being crazy. He took in the town paupers here from 1831 to 1837. I actually have a book handwritten by the town of Salem, and people would put a bid in to take in the poor people each year. In 1 year, he had like 11 poor people. And these people are infirm. They couldn't provide for themselves. They may have been sickly, And he got something like $360 back. I think it was 1837 or 1836. But so for about 6 years, he took in the town paupers. In 1838, he no longer takes in the town paupers, but he gets involved with the Underground Railway, helping slaves going to Canada. And before 1831, his children, he had 5 daughters, and he had 2 sons. One son died in Boston at the age of just going on 18 years of age. He was Jonathan Jr. So one of the things you hear all the year, Jonathan, his 6 Husky sons built a site. He only had 1 son. I don't know if he was Husky. The other son died at 5 daughters. And, they could have been Husky, but I don't know. But these sites, again, are not. If this was an isolated site, there was nothing like this anywhere else, maybe you could argue a little bit more about it being some eccentric, crazy shoemaker that built all of this, But there are thousands and thousands of feet of stone walls, and these walls are not only field stones, but they're big slabs, so there's a lot of quarried, fractured stones in the walls, which make them different than the post-colonial wall building. But yeah, that's true. Yeah, people do give Patty a lot of credit, but there's no physical evidence or archaeological or historical evidence that he built the site. But, he's the fall guy. The site shouldn't be here, first off. There shouldn't be any ancient stone work in the Northeast whatsoever. Most people don't realize that across America there were about 1 million mounds, and most of them were pyramidal mounds, like a wedding cake, rectangular, so there's geometric mounds, particularly in Ohio, but there's also effigy mounds across the nation, mounds shaped like animals, But these mounds go back over 5,000 years. They actually predate Stonehenge, like the Watson Brake Mound in Louisiana, or the Poverty Point Mounds. Those go back over 4,000 years. But they don't teach that in school. They don't teach that. Very few teachers will talk about these Northeast sites. We even have what look like the geoglyphs you can see down in Peru, the Nazca lines. And we have them from Kansas to the Colorado River in California near Blythe, not too far from the Mojave Desert. And there's something like 500 of them. And they said they're gigantic. In some cases, they're gigantic, earthworks. They actually cleared the dirt, so you have this figure. It could be a person, it could be an animal, it could be a geometric shape. But they don't teach about that either, and that's from here to California. But again, we're finding these stoneworks all the way to Mount Shasta in California. So the Pattys may have been very prolific. Maybe they did things all over the landscape like this. David Stewart Smith, before he died, he told me, he goes, I think what we have in the Northeast is a lithic or stone building culture that's been kind of ignored, not recognized, in some cases ridiculed, and it's really a shame, It looks like it was an ancient group of people that were building something up here, and who they were is the question, But thousands of years ago, people building these things. But again, our site is not by itself. There's, over 800 just in the Northeast alone.
Yeah, I mean, it is an intriguing thing, because as someone here living in the UK, we're kind of used to stumbling across ancient structures here, Dennis.
Yeah.
They still keep turning up. Though there was an amusing story recently where there was supposed to be a stone circle in Scotland that people were trying to date back to the times of the Druids, and it turned out that it was built by a farmer about 70 years ago who was just sick of these stones.
Yes.
So that threw a spanner in the works. But
that can happen.
Absolutely, they're still being uncovered.
Yep.
And I find it extremely fascinating because there are several things about America before colonialism that I find very intriguing. That it seems to be, I don't understand why there's not more excavation going on and more exploration in regards to these sites, because these mounds are all across America, from Washington State down to the Gulf of Mexico, Dennis, and there's earthworks and as you refer to, I know of several sites that are basically earthworks of giant snakes and things like that, which are incredible when you get an aerial view of these sites, Dennis.
Absolutely.
In regards to this particular site, as you referred to there, and as we touched on, Patty obviously gets sort of labelled as the creator of this, but I've often found that doesn't really make much sense, because if he had built this site, why did nobody else do what he did? Because it seems a remarkable amount of construction, as you say, for a guy who was a tax collector and did his bit in the local area, and people claim he might have gone mad, but clearly he hadn't, because he held down a career. He was obviously a man of the people and certainly very socially conscious. So it seems to me that it's one of those things that they just try to pigeonhole Patty as this kind of mad genius who built this site for no reason. And yet, if it was such a site and it was so easy to do, why are there not more of them?
Right, that's a great question. Yeah, it is difficult to build this, all the quarrying activity, the shaping, the transporting of the stones. But then again, what would they use it for in regards to, say, a farm or maybe a shoe shop? It just it's not functionally like that at all. Use stone foundations, for carriage houses, for your house, for your barn, for sheds, and then for stone wall building. But they have a whole different flavor and look. And when I grew up, I grew in the next town up about 7 miles from here, Derry, New Hampshire, where the first Irish potato farm was, because the Irish potato came from South America. But anyway, the farm is gone today, and unfortunately in the 70s they put up a development there. It's all gone. But we lived about 7 miles from here. My house was built next to 4 farms. The Pingree Hill Farm, Malo, and the J&F Farm, and the Bisbee Farm are all around us. So I grew up with farms, and saw farm walls and fences and barns and played in barns with the hay with the cows, chicken coops, and all of that. And our site has nothing like that at all, and you wouldn't build it from the ground up. The site, it does have what we think. Back in the 1930s, when Mr. Goodwin was here, his foreman was a gentleman from MIT, and he was Roscoe Whitney. He was an engineer from MIT, and he was kind of like mapping the site using a plane table. So he had cross sections, profile, and plan views, and we still have all of those plans today in our files, including Vincent Fagan from Notre Dame College. He was out here just a little bit later in the early 40s doing the same thing, mapping the site. So we not only have slides of the site, we have photographs, we have negatives of the site, and we have all these reports, plus we have all these drawings, diagrams, very nicely done. But what Roscoe said is whoever built this site either didn't give a damn or know about linear measurements, because I've looked at the imperial measurements of inches, feet, yards, and other measuring systems, and this site does not conform to that. Well, when you build a structure or an airplane or whatever you build, and I'm looking at a computer, I'm sure it has dimensions to it, but our site doesn't conform to that. What we have been doing is LIDAR, and the LIDAR, light detection and radar, we've been using is handheld. And this handheld is like the latest. It puts out 300,000 points per second. Each square meter is about 150,000 points compared to a drone, which is 400 to 800 points, and an airplane, which is only 4 to 8 points at this moment. It's probably getting better. So this gentleman came up from Connecticut this year, and he's done the 15 acres, 600 hours worth of processing, and it's 3-dimensional. and you can see down to about a centimeter. So we think we can use this to determine whether we have some standard unit of measure here, and they're looking at other sites too. In the 70s, when I made my diorama that you see when you walk into our visitor center, it's about 30 acres of the 110 acres, and I built it over 40 years ago. I made it. It's 1 inch equals 20 square feet. We went up on the site when I was making that just to get a couple other measurements of some of the structures, and we were aware of Dr. Tom at the time in the megalithic yard. So we kicked that around up there a little bit, and it seemed like the structures seemed to be kind of based on that, but we wouldn't take that and run with that. You'd want to be double checked, triple checked. You'd want to have it very accurately done by other people too, to make sure that the measurements were correct. But we did a little bit more measuring recently on the site with my son, who's an engineer too, and another gentleman who's a landscape architect. And it looks like the megalithic yard could be used on our site, but with this LiDAR, the 15 acres so far, we've already experimented with it. You can actually go and start measuring the chambers, the width, the height, the length of the structure or whatever. And they have been finding this, megalithic yard in South America. It's 83 centimeters and increments of that. And also in Mexico, like Teotihuacan in Mexico, which I've been to, or some of the mounds in the southern part of the United States, like Watson Break again and Poverty Point. There was a doctor from Brigham Young University in Utah, Dr. Clark, I think, and he was doing some of that work. And there's been some people that were actually doing that work earlier too, I think going back in the 60s, and they came upon that too, that this standard unit of measure might be another piece of evidence too, because if Patty's built a site, you'd think you'd find the inches, the feet, maybe the old rod. But yeah, even what we call the sacrificial table in its groove, works out nicely in quarters, halves, 3/4 of a megalithic yard. And I remember Tom's 1967 publication. We got most of his publications, going back even into the 50s. And I know he got involved with this in the 30s, but he said you can divide the megalithic yard into quarters, halves, 3/4, but never thirds, And then he had a megalithic rod, which is 2.5 megalithic yards. And he had some other megalithic inch, and a fathom, which is a half a megalithic yard. But it looks like we should look at that too, a little closer, because that might be a pretty strong, especially if you find the outside walls, where they go like the length of a serpentine wall, or maybe where a wall starts and then stops, measure that and just see if there's a repeating pattern of measurements. One by itself might be a coincidence, but if you keep finding this megalithic yard or something else used over and over again, there may be something to that. And,
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the most intriguing things about the site is what's known, Dennis, as the sacrificial table. Now, there's one thing I've seen about this is it's an incredible structure, and it's clearly been worked, because there's a groove around the edge of it and a point where clearly something can either come out of it or whatever. Now, I don't know much about the weather in the area, and because I know some people have said, oh well, it's clearly used for pressing apples.
Oh yeah.
Is this area known for its orchards?
It was an orchard, actually. Yeah, there are, in fact, in Londonderry, just up the street, there's dairy in Londonderry, but right up the street, there's a few apple orchards, and they're actually right now, it's a fall harvest and everything, and apples and pumpkins and everything. But the nearest apple orchard was about a half a mile from here down the hill. And people say, oh, if that was a cider press, and you got a cider mill up there, making, first off, you have some historical information, and you also find the archaeological, debris left behind, and there was none. But you can't get a horse in a wagon bringing the apples up to the table. I have 3 different ATVs, all terrain vehicles, and one's a small ATC. It's small. I can't get that in there to get the leaves out each. I'll be doing that soon too. I have to carry all the leaves by hand because there's no way to get. There's a big monolith. There's a ramp. There's a table, and there's another monolith on the other side. There's the oracle chamber. There's no way to get even one horse in there with a small wagon to bring your apples, and then to take away the pulp, the stuff that you squeezed, or the product itself. You can't. There's just no way. Yeah. And the tables, by the way, the groove is actually not rectangular. We measured it. It's about 9 inches narrower at the top. It's trapezoid in shape. And by the way, that seems to be the floor plan of a courtyard. where the patty house was eventually built, and it was just something they adapted into a cellar. Another structure called the Chamber in Ruins, where we got 3 radiocarbon datings out of it in the 1960s and early 70s. Its floor plan seems, again, to be trapezoid. We looked at the LiDAR imaging, too, plus measured it. The roof slab has fallen into it at some time in the past. It's about a 7,000-pound roof slab with a 1,000-pound lintel. They both collapsed into it. So it's a little hard to maneuver in there when you're measuring it, but the LiDAR shows it. There's another little niche near the sacrificial table. Some people suggest that the animal could be kept there before sacrifice. Who knows? It's, it's all opinions and stories. But when you look at the LiDAR, and I measured it too, it's like, oh my God, it's trapezoid. Now the table's groove, Dave Stewart Smith thought it was 4 by 6 feet, which would be imperial measurement. I went up and measured it. And Dave was very sick at the time, and I said, Dave, are you measuring from the center of the groove to the center? He goes, yeah. He goes, it might have been a later addition by Patty. The table might be I went up and measured it, and it comes out beautifully. It's at the bottom, it's 1.5 megalithic yards. At the top, it's 1.25. And the length of it is 2 megalithic yards. The table overall, it's bell-shaped, is 2.5 megalithic yards. And up near the top towards the oracle chamber is 2 megalithic yards. And the height of the table at the top above bedrock is like 1 megalithic yard. And so most apple cider presses, they're about 18 inches to 12 inches above the ground. This one's about 30, almost 33, just, 32, 64 is a megalithic yard, and this is what it is. But I was surprised. It's trapezoid in shape, and it works out beautifully. Now, if you use inches, it's like, 88 and a half inches, one of the measurements, 49.3, whatever, but in megalithic yards, it comes out nicely. And the chambers do, the standing stones do. And we did a lot of measuring up there just in the last couple of years. And I think the LiDAR is going to be very objective. And I think it'll be something that will be a great tool to feed in different measuring systems and see what comes out, But, but the table, it's about 9,000 pounds. It came from 40 feet away. And you can see the quarry place it came out of. There are no modern drill marks. The drill marks are a way, they use plug and feather. They would actually split stones. We actually have one of the toolkits. But there's only about 16 modern drill holes where quarrymen during the patty area were actually taking the site apart. They were selling off the stones. The patties weren't building. They were actually having the quarrymen take the stones away for local projects. And you can see but if the whole site was built during the patty era, you'd find probably hundreds, if not thousands, of these drill marks where they would put the plug and feather in there to split the stones. And that technology was around 1800 that started, roughly, around that era. And we actually have one of the toolkits in our display case because somebody up there during that time of taking the site apart, even like other sites you go to in the world, parts of it are missing, that people take it. I was at Nowth, I think, in Delft and Newgrange, and I believe it was Delft. We were there with my dad. What's that big crater in the middle of it? I think it was Delft. And to come to find out, during the Irish potato famine, I believe they said there was a works project to build roads, and they put people to work. And if I got my story straight, this is 1983, so it's been a while. They actually removed part of the structure for the foundation of roads. They took all these stones out of there, and it looks like a big crater. So this is not unusual for people to steal things like off the pyramids. The limestone's gone, in Egypt. I think part of Stonehenge, part of Stonehenge, people were taking little souvenirs away. They used to have a hammer there, which is sad, right? I mean, it's sad, but that's what happens. And we love and care of our site and all these sites. Vandalism's a problem across the world. Even the national parks are losing some of their petroglyphs out west. So we've done some radio shows about that too. Because people should respect and care. You may not agree with somebody's hypotheses or theory or idea, but you don't go in and start destroying and taking things away. And that's what's going on out there too.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I know you had a pretty nasty spate of vandalism last year, I think. Did someone turned up with power tools or something, Dennis?
You heard that? Yeah, boy, the word spread across the ocean. Absolutely, it was a worse vandalism and intentional, and that is still on. The warrant is out for the arrest of the person. They haven't. In the 12 months I've been talking to the detective. I talked to him yesterday, and it could happen any day. But it was intentional, and the person came from a few hundred miles away. some ideology they have. They thought they could attack our site and try to destroy the table, and they did heavy damage to it. They also attacked a church in Sedona, Arizona. I think it's the same group, the same night, the day before. And one of the Masonic temples in New Hampshire, one of the oldest ones in New England, was burnt down the night that our site was attacked. And this group, I guess, doesn't like the Masons either, So, they don't like anything but their own. It's just awful, So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things I've always been interested in as well, Dennis. There are two things I'm intrigued by. Is firstly, does the stonework show any sign of working? Have these stones been smoothed or shaped in any way? And if so, do we have an inclination of what tools were perhaps used?
That's a great question, Paul. Yeah, that was David Stewart Smith when he began working on our site in 1978. And by 1982, they found that first slab, the staff member found it. And again, what they found was the edges of these stones were actually being shaped using that percussion flaking, one stone hammer, striking it, knocking out flakes to actually shape it, or what we call dressing the stone. But we also found abrasions. Some of these beautiful monoliths that are stood up, and they vary from like several feet up to the biggest one we got is 14 feet, which is fallen, and it's almost like a menhir, a long stone. It's in 3 pieces, and it was aligned with a star Isa, according to Dr. Winkler from Penn State. He passed away almost 20 years ago, but he worked on our site for a few years right after he retired from Penn State. He was an archaeoastronomer there for 30 years. He would drive all the way up from Pennsylvania. But some of the stones actually are smooth on top, and they're so smooth, it's like, oh my God. So Dave Stewart Smith says, it sounds like they did abrasion. They would take a stone and rub it and rub it and rub it. They may have poured sand on it, too, to help with an abrasion effect. So we had the abrasion. We have actually a network of storm drains. These are underground storm drains, 12 of them, and one of them runs 75 feet. Some run 12 feet, 15. One in the Oracle Chamber, the biggest structure still on the site that wasn't damaged during the Patty era, has a drain, actually 2 drains, but the longest one inside of it is 45 feet. It goes underground, parallel walls with capstones, just like little structures. And some of these have been excavated where they'll find different types of artifacts because they wash into the drains or fall into the drains. But before the underground drain, the bedrock actually has been channeled, and this bedrock is granite. I mean, you can take a hammer, a nice heavy-duty hammer or maul, and strike the bedrock, and it'll bounce off, almost hit you in the head, and it'll leave like a little tiny mark where it knocks off the patina on the rock. And that's about it. So, but these are like 4 or 5 inches wide through the bedrock, and maybe an inch and a half deep, and they'll run for dozens of feet, and they'll channel the water into the underground drain. So that's another thing they did, is shaping the bedrock, and they channeled it. They actually shaped the big stones using percussion flaking. And then they used abrasion, too, on some stones. And if you ever visit, I can show you a couple of them. They're so smooth. It's like, but why would they bother? Who would bother with We do have 51 astronomical alignments, and that was surveyed from 73 to 1977, and that was triggered by 1965 Stonehenge Decoded by Gerald Hopkins, who's from England, and he lived over here, and I think it was at Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics in Cambridge, Mass. But CBS station over here put out a thing called The Mysteries of Stonehenge that year, 1965. And that's what really triggered the interest in these stones that were standing way out in the woods. We were aware of them. Mr. Goodwin even knew about them. Some weren't even on his 20-acre property there. A couple of them were and some weren't, So they're out there, so we have 51 lines. But when they sent that data, the survey data, it took 5 years because you're doing it piecemeal as we could afford it. We'd pay the surveyor to come in. And that was fed into the Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics computer in 77 and 78. The data came back. So, well, if these were used for astronomical purposes, they would work about 1800 BC, plus or minus a couple hundred years due to the Earth's tilt, the 41,000-year obligity cycle of the Earth's tilt, And then you have the precessional 26,000-year cycle, too. And so that agreed with the oldest carbon dating on the main site, that 1-acre area, from 1971. And that was of the chamber in ruins. There was a third dating from that chamber, actually the third one. And the first one was a piece of root that dated to 1690 AD, as you mentioned, the trees. So the 30s is a stump there, and the early photographs really rotted, a white pine tree stump. It was so rotted you couldn't do dendrochronology. But they estimated its diameter and state of decay, and Goodwin thought maybe it was about 300 years old. So that's putting it back into the 1600s 1800s probably. And in 1967, they actually dug down, and by golly, they found, and we got the pictures of it. There's the pieces of the root from the tree. They hadn't completely disintegrated in 67, and they removed these roots from the wall. They were actually growing through the wall, and they dated those roots at Geochrome Laboratories in Cambridge, Massachusetts to 1690 AD, plus or minus, I think, like 50 years. So this puts it back before patties, the first patty coming into the area. And in 1969, they went down and they excavated further, and kind of disappointed initially because all they found was sterile soil as they kept going down. I think it was a 5 by 5 foot excavation area. But they did come upon, as they get down a little bit lower, charcoal flakes, and they also found hammerstone, rubbing stones, stone scrapers, and stone spallings. The stone spallings are from the process of shaping the stones, that percussion flaking. So they found stone tools, and they found some remains of where somebody had been striking and shaping a stone. That charcoal was sent again down to Massachusetts. The date came back 3,000 years before present. And in 71, they went adjacent to that further down, and it's next to a wall. And they dated that to 4,000. Now, below all of this dirt and tools and charcoal, the bedrock had been quarried by the original builders. It was removed, and all of this stuff was deposited after. And the stone that was removed was used for wall stones and possibly roof slabs or whatever, but they actually had to remove they removed all the bedrock down a certain distance, and then later they built a wall, and then all the stuff built up next to the wall over time, which it would do, Yeah. And that's the tools came along, and so the 1978 results from Harvard agreed with the 1971, about 4,000 years old. And recently we've used a new dating called optically stimulated luminescence. It was 3 weeks ago. It was a month ago tomorrow. It was on 9/11, and we had 23 people here. We had 2 state archaeologists. We had people from the New England Antiquities Research Association's research committee. We had past president of the New Hampshire Archaeological Society and her assistant. We had 2 people from Brookhaven National Laboratory in Long Island, New York, and we had Dr. Feathers. He's an archaeologist from University of Washington. And he came out because they had to all go through the COVID-19 testing. So we had 25 people here, including ground penetration radar, a lady with her equipment and her assistant, and we had the LIDAR here. So we mapped where the cores are going to be taken. And optically stimulated luminescence basically dates the age of dirt. And so if you have dirt on a roof, which they did take some cores from the Oracle Chamber roof, it was almost 24 inches deep, which surprised the heck out of us. Yeah. We thought it was only several inches deep. Well, they got the bottom dirt, and that's basically how, the thing is you have to be cautious about is it's a minimum date for one thing. It's also, was it contaminated by chipmunks digging holes in the soil, maybe Mr. Patty disturbing it or his kids or something. It can give you a false, but it's a minimum date. Now, they just did a chamber 2 years ago in Pennsylvania, and it may be a related structure perhaps. And the date on that came back took 2 years to get the results back, the same process, and it was 450 BC was the medium date. So the structure was already there in 450. So what people thought was colonial or post-colonial, like, the Patty kind of thing, that structure right there, right now appears to have been built before Christ.
One of the other things that I'm interested to know, Dennis, is has there been any finds in regards to signs of life in the area? I mean, often we find these sites and we'll find things like pottery or leather or bones or something that shows that people were there and thereabouts. So I know you've referred to perhaps some tools being found and things, but has any excavations revealed any other kind of items at all?
Yeah, I mean, we got the historic and the colonial, post-colonial, because the Patties were here as early as the 70s. But yes, bones have been found. 3 bones were found on what we call the plaza area by Mr. Goodwin back around 1938. In 1968, a local school teacher from Timberland High School actually brought him down to the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C., and a Dr. Lucy Hoyen, I think her name was. She was a physical anthropologist, examined the bones. She actually examined those 3 bones plus a couple bones from a chamber we call the Watch House. And a couple weren't really identifiable. One of them they thought was bison or buffalo, and that was kind of a surprise. She talked to some of her colleagues and said, she didn't at first tell him where it was from, and he agreed it was buffalo. And then she goes, well, it's from New Hampshire. She goes, well, if you go back far enough in time, because the buffalo weren't just out west, they were across the continent. But so those in the watch house. And then we found a stone pendant and a bone pendant in the watch house. They both have little drill holes, so they could have been worn like for jewelry. They were found. And on the main set, again, those 3 other bones, what she said is they're what she thought was they're kind of dense material. She said, my thought is that these are human bones. They do have marks on them, like little scratches that were done while the person was alive, apparently. And I'm not sure how they detect that, but she said that. She had doctorates in this, back in 68. She said, they were a little denser than I would have expected. And she goes, I think they're, and then she had a PS. My personal feeling is that these are human bones at the end of the hole. And I got I get that all in record. Now, you can't carbon date them anymore because they've been out of the ground for 80-something years. They've been exposed to the elements. And my best knowledge is when you, radiocarbon 14, anything you use organically has to be protected when you take it out of the ground, and it has to be sent to the laboratory. Well, these have been sitting on our display case since the 60s, and they basically what we've been thinking about is a possible DNA study. And whether they'd be candidates for that, And I identified them this year. They've been sitting in there. We've been looking at for years. I was going through all my dad's records for almost 100 years. He's got stuff before he was even born that's on this site. But I was going through the records, and I found this whole thing about bones that I had heard about, but I had forgotten, I mean, I was a kid in 68, and they made it to the newspaper. There was a little bit of interest and excitement, but you couldn't carbon date them. She analyzed them. They sent them back here. No DNA at the time in 68. So I think maybe the time is right. And I do have some people, and we have a laboratory in Canada that this person has already used. So that's a possibility. So yes, the bones in New England, they'll usually rot within a few centuries due to the acidity in the soil. It eaten up pretty quickly. I belonged to the New Hampshire Archaeological Society, as my dad did, and my uncle was the vice president of that. But I get their publications, and occasionally you'll see bones a few thousand years old. But for the most part, we lose them in the soil here pretty quickly. Not maybe like in England, some of the chalky soil, maybe, in the southwest United States. We were just out west at the Four Corners looking at Chaco Canyon and Hoven Weep, and some of the wood, you go to visit the site, the National Park Rangers will say that wood right there, those logs there are about 800 years old. I'm looking at my God, they haven't rotted yet because it's so dry out there. It's amazing. They'll have stacks of wood, and it's like maybe, in New England, it might be 20 or 30 or 40-year-old trees that were cut, sitting there for 20 or 30. Now, these are like several hundred years old. So bones will also be pretty well preserved out there, too, Not like New England, though. Yeah, New England's kind of rough on everything, a bit rough on bones, particularly, I guess. And animals will eat up bones, too. But the east-west chamber we have looks like the gallery graves that are in Ireland. They're in Carnac. I've seen them in Carnac. I've been to Ireland, but I didn't get to the northwest part. They're in Holland. They call them the Giant's Bed, the Ruden Bed, or whatever it is. And then the V-Hut looks like wedge tombs of Ireland. In the same shaped structure, I have three-dimensional pictures of ones in Spain. Spain has in Portugal have amazing megalithic sites that are just, I don't think they're recognized like some of the other places, but it looks the same, the size, the shape, and the orientation. So the V-Hut faces southwest. The wedge tombs of Ireland that I saw with my dad face southwest. And the ones in Spain, I unfortunately don't have they didn't put the orientation on it, unfortunately. But they look just like our chamber, including the east-west chambers, too. And there's a couple of structures that look like fugus.
Yep.
And even the one I mentioned, the chamber in ruins, although the floor looks a little trapezoid shape in Karnak. My wife and I were riding bikes around there back in '84. I didn't have a cell phone. She had the Nikon F3 camera with her, and she was ahead of me, and she went straight. I took a left, and I yelled at her. I didn't see her for another 4 or 5 hours back at the hotel. She was mad at me, very, very angry with me. But I went in there, and I saw this chamber intact with its roof, and I said, our chamber in ruins would look like, the one that we had the 3 carbon datings, would look like if the roof was still intact with its lintel stone. It looked just so much like it. But I didn't have a camera, and I can never find that when I Google it. I can find the staining stones, Lamenic and all of that in Karnak where we've been, but I could never find that anywhere on Google. I don't know the name of the structure, and And I had friends that were there last year in Scotland and France, twice. And I said, can you please go find this chamber? And they showed me a picture of something else. I think it was like one of those gallery graves, It was not that structure. So I don't know. But,
How frustrating.
Yeah.
So what's next, Dennis? Where do we need to go in regards to getting more people to take this site seriously? How do we push this case forwards in regards to more people giving us more scientific support and really getting to grips with what the possibilities of this site could be?
I think the OSL testing will be interesting. It will take almost a year for that to come back, though. It used to be 5 years, and getting it down. I think the standard unit of measure is something interesting. There is a gentleman that retired from Washington, D.C. He was in the National Historic Registry, and what they do is you have to go through your state, and then you have to go through Washington, D.C., and then you get a site on the National Register Historic Site. So he was in that, but he's also working with NERA. My dad's group started in '64, the New England Antiquities Research Association. I think I mentioned that a couple times. He's interested in, and I mentioned this 2 years ago, that these serpentine walls can't be mistaken for a farmer's wall, not with a head, undulating body. And some of the walls, by the way, are linear, some are rectilinear, and some are just curvilinear, just beautiful sweeping serpents. And they're found from here to Mount Shasta. He's on board with that. They might get recognition, and we have 13 of them here. I think that may be a backway door of getting people interested in the rest of the structures here. And structures, the highest number of structures are in the Hudson Valley north of New York City. There's something like 500 of them down there. And the serpentine walls there too, by the way. And Vermont has the most inscriptions. They might be Ogham or Ogham. We used to call it Ogham up in Vermont. But there's serpentine walls there too. And again, all the way across the country, we're finding Indiana has them, Alabama has them. I think if these walls get recognized as something that's prehistoric, it will show that people were building out of stone before the colonial period. And I think that opens the door up to looking at the structures, the cairns, the standing stones, the menhirs, and the rest of the, stone structures, be taken more seriously. I think, I think that's the way to go. And this gentleman's interested in it. He knows the red tape and all the bureaucracy, and I think he might be helpful,
Fantastic. So going forwards then, Dennis, obviously, as you said, I would imagine you had quite an interesting year, because it's probably not the easiest site to maintain and to explore, because I think, obviously, we've all had a variety of challenges this year, regardless of where we are in the world, sadly. So once all things considered, things hopefully get back to as near to normal as they are, what's next for you and your family in regards to what you want to do on the site?
I think we're going to work more on the LiDAR imaging. As I mentioned, standard units of measure. We do have more archaeology. In fact, a lady, she's in her 80s now. She was a past president of New Hampshire Archaeological Society. She's supposed to be digging, I believe it'll be later this month. We'll be working on an area that could be a habitat site. So she's been with us since '89, and she's done shovel test pit study across the hilltop. And her husband was a doctor of geology at Tufts University, so he was great for the geology of the site too. And so we're going to be doing more archaeological excavations. Archaeology by itself is kind of destructive in a way. Once you dig a thing up, you any future information you can get out of it with better technology, is now gone. So we try to be careful with the archaeology, some restoration work, and I think the looking at, like I mentioned, with the LiDAR, we have been using ground penetration radar. And I want to get back on the road, too, and go see some of the sites out west, like in Mount Shasta, to compare them to our stone features. In fact, twice this year, we've canceled trips to the southern part of the United States to look at some of the mounds and rattlesnake walls in Alabama, with a doc. It begins with an F. Holstein. He's from Jacksonville State University, 40 years as an archaeologist. I've been corresponding with him. He's excited about our serpents, and he goes, we got serpentine walls down here we call rattlesnake walls, and they have standing stones and cairns. So I want to get down there and compare that too. And then I want to get back over to England, of course, and see some of the things, as I mentioned, that spirit windows and some, there are a few serpents over in Europe, in Scotland, and also near Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. There's actually a serpent mound there, and I saw it, and one of my friends has been over there, and I said, did you see that serpent mound? He goes, yeah, I'm aware of it. I saw it, and I said, well, you never told me about that. And I Googled it, and it looks like the one in Ohio. But I said, is it artificial or is it natural, And they think it's man-made, it's gigantic. But, I'd love to get over there, too, and see that. So serpent's a worldwide thing, by the way. It's not just a particular culture, It's everywhere. It seems like. So.
Absolutely. So, Dennis, I mean, I just find it a very fascinating subject, and I've gone extensively through your site and looked at everything. Where can everybody keep up to date with your work and keep their eye on what's happening and find out any further information if they want to dive into this enigmatic mystery?
Our website, StonehengeUSA.com. And if you go in there, you can actually download a 12-minute video presentation that we have in our theater. Our theater's closed right now due to COVID-19. They can also download under an app. They can download a whole virtual tour on our mobile app. And what it is, it has pictures, it has text, and it talks to you. It'll do a complete tour. You can do it from your couch at home if you like. And you can do a complete tour of our site. And then when you come here, you can actually use it on the tour. And it's something people can look at and say, yeah, I'm kind of interested in that site. Or, yeah, I'm not really interested in, ancient rocks and stuff like that. But, you can see what it is. And it's actually quite well. But we're on Facebook. We're on Instagram. And back on the website, there's an email address. So if anybody wants to ask us questions, we'd be more than happy to try to answer them if we can, And there's a phone number there, too. But I think that free app download is really good, and people that use it here really love it. The national parks are just starting to use it over here. We've done it for about 2 years. People come, they can use it for free here, and again, in England, you can download that and take a complete tour of our site and, make up your own mind or, whatever,
Yeah, very much so. And that's StonehengeUSA.com, is it not?
That is. That's our website, yeah.
Absolutely. Well, listen, thank you, Dennis, for joining me. It like I say, it's something I've been aware of for a very long time, and I can't put my finger on anything. It's one of those things that every time you think you found a solution or you think something's been disproved, something else turns up just to turn it on its head. So thank you for joining me. It is a fascinating site, and I wish you all the very best. And whatever happens, I really do hope we finally get to the bottom of this and you get some conclusive proof to support what you believe, my friend.
Oh, thank you so much, and your listeners too. We really appreciate the opportunity of being on with you today. And it is a frustration to us because I'd like to know the answers too. And like you say, every time you find there's something new, and it's like it adds more questions to the whole mystery. And I've had nightmares about it, believe me. So, well, thank you so much, Paul.
Hey, you take care. Look after yourselves.
Take care. Bye bye now.